I mean, I think it's about creating common knowledge between parties about what people's needs are. Of course, that's easier said than done.
Mm.
But I mean, I think really therapy needs to move towards some communal healing model.
I'm Adam Hunt, and this is the Evolving Psychiatry podcast, rethinking mental health through an evolutionary lens. Share it with the people who matter, like it if you like it, subscribe if you want to hear more. Okay, Kristen, you're an evolutionary anthropologist at VU University. Anyone who's interested in the main theories you've been working on in your work on self-harm and suicidal behavior should listen to our last episode. But now we're going to talk mainly about the Chon Chuuk, the population which you study mostly. Could you just speak a little bit about who they are, where they're from, and paint a bit of a picture of Chuuk's life?
Yeah, so Chon Chuuk are indigenous to Chuuk State in the Federated States of Micronesia and the Caroline Islands. So it's a scattering of volcanic islands sort of in the population center. And then there's a scattering of coral atolls. But they're not just in Chuuk. So there is an agreement between the United States and the Federated States of Micronesia that FSM citizens can live and work in the U.S. There's no pathway to citizenship, but they can come and live in the U.S. Their children, if they're born there, can be U.S. citizens. And so many, just in recent decades, many Chon Chuuk have been coming to the U.S., primarily Guam, Hawaii, and just outside of Portland, Oregon, in the Pacific Northwest. So they're a transnational population. I worked with primarily with the migrant population in Portland, Oregon, and they're just constantly on the move. So many people that I got to know, I worked through there for over a 2-year period. I was collecting this data and doing participant observation at a Chon Chuuk church, where I was also recruiting participants. And, people were just constantly coming and going from the islands or going to Hawaii or to Guam. So they're just a population on the move. And that's just part of their, who they are now.
And they have these much more traditional family structures, right? The way their kind of communities are structured is at least somewhat more similar to how we might think ancestral humans would have lived. They're closer to families. They live in these extended networks. They have quite strict norms. Could you just talk a little bit about that aspect of life, which comes into your recent paper quite heavily?
Yeah, so historically they are matrilineal. So the clan is based on matrilineal descent, and who you consider kin can extend up to fifth cousins. So a very broad social network within the household. They're also traditionally matrilocal. That's changed quite a bit. There's more flexibility now, but that the matrilineal bias is still there. You still sense that. Mm-hmm. But the father's kin are also considered family members. Authority in the family is very strictly based on age and sex, but particularly age. So parents, elders have, they just have more authority than younger people. Young children at a very young age, they learn how to follow orders and do what their parents tell them. And that's not to say a bad thing. That's kind of the model that we've moved away from in the US.
Right. It contrasts quite heavily with the US, which your paper goes into quite a lot, is that, especially the children growing up there who kind of see what how the US peers live in comparison to their strict family structure, leads to this maybe more obvious conflict or more reason for them to kind of engage in these sort of conflicts that you're interested in.
Well, what's interesting is actually we didn't find that like social and cultural norms were related to like more like high severity conflicts, but they perceive it. I mean, they think.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
So like the parents, especially the parents who live in the US, they're very concerned about they don't even have a word for individualism or independence. There's a word for independence in the Chuukese language. So I had some issues translating some things a while back. Right. But the parents are very concerned. So those who come of age in the US, their parents very much want to impart Chuukese values and, to maintain that family connection that they feel like Americans don't value their family. They're more independent. They're more out for themselves. And so, and they also perceive, like the talking back, like American kids do that. And it's like, that's like really not okay. They still do it. And in fact, they do it in Chuuk too. I was actually
Okay.
surprised. Like, I didn't actually see much of a difference there. So with people who are older and recalling conflicts back in Chuuk, they would actually did report like talking back to their parents, yelling at their parents, and it's like, oh, that's interesting. But they say they didn't do that. Like,
Okay, right. But it's people being like, "Oh no, our norms, our traditions are that there's no arguments at all, and that everyone's obedient." But actually, in reality, then yeah, that's they're more
yeah, it
normal.
comes up
than
maybe more than they realize.
It's more well. This kind of gets onto your point about this being sort of an evolved, natural like instinct, or this sort of strategy of bargaining at this age, right? That this is not something new to our society. That a young or an adolescent, especially, or a person who's kind of under the control of their family, has their own interests in mind, and they have to kind of pursue their own life. This is just a sort of a basic fact of genetics and evolutionary fitness. Like you have your own fitness is more important to you than your parents' fitness.
Yeah, yeah,
Um,
and you're inevitably going to conflict
right.
over that. Especially, a really great example. It did come up in the Chuukese data, but comes up across societies, especially for female, like women attempting suicide or suicide-like behaviors, like running into the bush, like putting themselves at risk.
Right.
Is forced marriages or unwanted or wanting to get out of a marriage.
Right. Interesting.
And so
Yeah.
what's one example I wanted to give, and it comes up, both in, Papua New Guinea, we see it in foragers in Africa, is where you have sort of sister exchanges between, two men. They exchange their sisters.
Mm.
Um, in many of these cases, it gets downright violent. I mean, it's a game of chicken
Okay.
of the brother trying to beat his sister into
Jeez.
this marrying this guy so that he can get a wife,
Okay.
and the sister attempting suicide.
God, yeah. And
Um,
right, and so the reason why this is so like clearly an evolutionarily relevant situation is like this is the person you're going to have your children with. These are the genes you're going to share, and it's the most important decision, arguably, right,
yeah,
of
and
your
it's the
life.
reproductive interest of the brother versus the reproductive interest of the sister.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, this probably also does ring true to parents who've had arguments over boyfriends or going out late or whatever in modern society. Some things have stayed the same. And your recent paper is really rich in these sorts of anecdotes. I wonder if you could just talk through a couple of the anecdotes that are sort of interesting and reveal something about the social environments which lead to these sorts of behaviors and how they resolve.
Well,
Yeah.
well, yeah. I want to. So the term for these behaviors involving withdrawal, social withdrawal, there's a word for that in the Chuukese language called a mudamun, and it's not an emotion state. It's a refers to strategies.
Okay.
So it could be low cost behavior, such as just avoiding a person. It could be, you're like sulking in another room, something along those
Mm.
lines.
Mm.
It could be,
So it's like behavioral strategies. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Interesting.
yeah, you could be trying to replace that relationship or just spending time away from home, up to running away,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
which in Chuuk is also a suicide threat. It's considered a threat of suicide. So if you run away at night, you're sort of saying that's in the mind of your family members that you may be threatening suicide. You may attempt suicide.
Right.
All the way up to suicide death is all part of this a Mudamun gamut.
Okay.
And it was actually this their cultural model that was very influential to the bargaining model.
Right. Fascinating.
Because it's not even just Chuuk. It says these sort of social withdrawal strategies. We not only see them in diverse societies, but there's also specific words for it in different societies. So in Samoa, it's musu.
It's interesting because, yeah, a lot of these behaviors, again, seem familiar, although I suppose we don't have like one word to describe them, right? We, running away or being rebellious or going to your room or not talking or not cooperating.
Yeah, we call it like sulking, pouting, both
right.
pejorative kind of terms.
Yeah, rebelling. Yeah, right. Right, interesting. And so are there any kind of there's a couple of really nice key anecdotes you bring of, I think one young woman who runs off after being away with her boyfriend. Could you kind of take us through that a little bit?
Yeah. So there were several interesting cases of running away, and they tended to be effective. That was actually a key finding, but not always. So the one young woman, she was in the United States, in Hawaii. She's 16 years old, and she started seeing a boyfriend, which is a big no-no in Chuuk culture. In the past, you have your affairs in the bush. You don't bring that home, you know?
Oh,
So
interesting.
there was some like premarital sexual freedom, but you don't bring your family involved. That is very disrespectful. So
Really?
it's sort of, there is sort of a clash there with the sort of the American, you just bring your boyfriend home to dinner kind of thing.
Oh, interesting.
Um,
Okay, so the first time that you're meant to be doing that is when it's like someone who's been approved and you're actually going to marry them or something, or it's like very official, or
yeah, like you get married and that's like the sanctioned sexual activity, but there's like unsanctioned, sexual activity,
sure.
this kind of, actually in the old days, it was the man would sneak into the woman's house.
Right.
And then actually some guy, this was actually one of the interviews that came up too. So within the ethnographic record is also in my interviews. So it's so nice when these things like align. And he was talking about, he also had a conflict about a girlfriend. So it's not a US thing. He also had conflict with his parents in Chuuk about having a girlfriend. And he talked about, sneaking into the girlfriend's house. And, it's like, one room,
I was going to say, how can you sneak
one
into
room. Like,
a one-room
everyone's
house?
asleep, and you
No.
just sneak in while everyone's asleep. But yeah, there's the risk that somebody wakes up, and the father woke up, and he's like, "Yeah,
Jesus.
I had to run down the street," and the father's like shouting at me, threatening to kill me. Like,
Oh my God. Did it work out? I mean,
it worked out for him. Well, this guy, so his problem was a very common problem. He had alcohol use. That's a very important, like, male status seeking activity. Alcohol use and sort of like risk taking behaviors.
it sounds familiar. Yeah.
And sexual activity, yeah, very similar to what happens on college campuses,
Right, right.
um so he ended up living with his grandmother, helping out with the gardening there, so that his grandmother didn't care basically if he had a girlfriend, so that was how that conflict got resolved,
Okay.
was moving away, living with his grandmother instead of his parents, who took more issue with it.
Okay. And to go back to the example you bring up in your paper, this young girl runs away, and yeah, the family don't like that she has a boyfriend, so it's sanctioned and they're worried. And then is it that she stays overnight somewhere and then
Was gone, and actually there were actually a couple cases very similar to this.
uh,
So this particular case, she stayed away for several days
right.
with the boyfriend.
Mm,
Eventually she's like, well, I've got to go back.
mm,
And it's sort of shameful because, it's like, she was involved in sexual activity, so that's kind of embarrassing. The fact that she even escalated it this far is like, oh man, like,
right.
now I got to go home and like face the music. Because I'm
Yeah.
just like, I can't just stay at the bus station any longer. Like,
Right. Yeah. Jesus.
and yeah, when she got back, the whole family was gathered there. She had to apologize one by one. This is something that comes up again. So wait, you apologize, one by one to the aunt and uncle and cousins, like, I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I'm sorry.
Mm,
Nevertheless, in the end, her parents, said, okay, you can have your boyfriend, because like they're just
okay.
exhausted. It's just like,
Right. Well, you show how far you're willing to go for love, right? Or for,
yeah,
that it is a kind of, it's proof. It's kind of a costly, and like, you're going to get in trouble, and they know you're going to get in trouble, and you're just saying, hey, no, this is important enough for me that I'm willing to run off and leave you. Yeah. And which goes back to your entire model of, these sort of, this whole suite of behaviors, which are about really informing the people around you how important something is to you, or how they
exactly.
need to kind of let off a little bit and let you kind of engage in your own activities.
Yeah. And the other example of running away, which was actually in the 70s, back on Chuuk, was another young woman. But in this case, it was status building activities at church, because that's where it's a site where women engage in status building activities. They gain status through volunteer or working with the children, working with youth, being a teacher. And it was the same thing. I mean, not different conflict, but she came home. Her father was so mad. You're home late again. And he said, okay, well, you're not my daughter anymore. And she sort of called him on it. I was like, okay, like, I'm going out.
Okay.
And
Interesting.
she spent like 2 nights in the bush.
Mm,
And it's not, I mean, in that society, like, a woman who is alone is at risk of rape. So
right.
there are really real risks involved.
Yeah.
She was like, in the rain for a bit. She ended up being discovered by her, a sister or somebody.
Mm,
No, I think it was an aunt who walked her home. And that aunt who had authority sort of was a third party to help resolve the conflict.
Okay.
because the parents saw her coming home with the aunt, and they were like, okay, it's over. The father apologized. They both apologized, and the father said, okay, just don't come home late anymore. It's over.
I'm wondering what like the message is for. I had a thought, which is like part of the message is for the parents, but also maybe there might be some message here for the teenagers who are kind of thinking of running off, and to some extent we're sort of like justifying it or being like, oh yeah, if you engage in costly behaviors, then you
Yeah.
might get what you achieve. There's this weird aspect which is like, yeah, if
We
you
don't
really
want
want
to.
to.
We don't want to give the youth bad ideas.
Well, like, we're at the age where we're past that. But for any whatever 16-year-old who's thinking this, like, oh no, is listening to this might just think, oh, okay, well, actually, yeah, one way to get my parents to accept my demands is engaging in these like costly behaviors. Which, yeah, I mean, obviously, we're not
I mean,
endorsing
on the
that,
one
but
hand, there is some like cultural transmission maybe happening there. I think on the other hand, I think generally, and this is what we found, this is what keep finding, that it's the more high severity the conflict. So, the high severity conflicts in this case involving abuse, neglect, being kicked out of the home as that woman was. I mean, she was really threatened with being like turned out on her ear.
yeah,
So it's only in those situations where the parent has already escalated it to a point.
right,
Um,
yeah.
that
So,
you see because they it's not, people just don't do it for trivial reasons. There's no
mm,
that I didn't find evidence that people do this for trivial reasons.
right. Yeah, and the emotion is the strategy enough. You don't need to kind of plan it, right? When you're in that situation, and this is the whole point of why I think it's so interesting in your work. It's just like, yeah, the really strong emotions that you feel of rebellion or like hate of your elders, or like, it's so much so that you're willing to put yourself through complete hell. You don't experience it as something to, as like a conscious strategy as much as it's like, that you have to do this thing to kind of prove to them that what you're worth or how you feel.
Yeah.
And
And
yeah,
it's amazing how much creativity there is involved in this. So, like, I mean, humans demonstrate creativity in trying to resolve conflict. So, among Libyan Bedouin, one thing one woman did to resolve a conflict about a marriage to a cousin she didn't want was to dump black ink all over herself because it was the last of the ink.
okay.
And she just dumped it on her body. And they were just like, well, now there's no more ink to dye your marital tent. Like, so
Right, interesting.
it's like, yeah, people, so that's what I'm interested in, is why do people go this way versus that way? I mean, it really depends on what's at their disposal, and, figuring out like how can people, I assume people do use their environment, what's at their
Right.
disposal in the best way, most efficient way they can.
Yes, yeah. The
That they
adaptation
wouldn't,
is, view would be that there is like different things of different costliness in every society, and like in that situation, depending on how much you need to kind of impose a cost on yourself, or then you'll pick the thing which is appropriate for the scenario, or appropriate to how much you feel you're being undervalued or something like that.
Maybe some people, writing poetry is an option for them. I'm just saying, it's, there could be these
Their
different ways
parents
of
will
like,
hate it. They're like, oh god, no, okay, stop writing this poetry in your room all
people
day.
use poetry to, to get lovers, to do all sorts of things. And so to resolve, express strong feelings. Not everyone has those skills, or it's not going to work the same for everybody, depending on the nature of the conflict. So there's a lot of, depending on the nature of the conflict, depending on how much private information there is, and just what people have at their disposal, and the severity of the conflict itself. So these are all things like I'm trying to understand, what affects the choices people make,
Right.
how they go about resolving conflicts.
But it is a really interesting of sort of a universal-ish human behavior, or something that you've obviously found really explicitly in this group, the Chon Chuuk or Chukis. So yeah, it's a prime candidate for some kind of evolutionary explanation, and I think that the explanation you come to is something that is quite intuitive and that makes a lot of sense, and that we've experienced in our own lives. So it's actually really good.
I think it's just the value of anthropological research. You just, you
Right.
come across a concept, you're like, wow, that actually makes a lot of sense. And we just don't have this in our society. We don't have this concept.
Yeah, it's really interesting that you kind of came at it from the bottom up as well, that you actually went to the society and found that they had this behavior, and then just tried to explain it, and then it makes sense of something in our own in our own modern life as well. So maybe that's a better way that evolutionary psychiatry should kind of go about, thinking about these things. So any last words on like what this means for people, like how they can, how they should think differently about these behaviors, how they might improve their own relationships or the struggles that they're going through, how psychiatrists might think differently about this? Is there anything practical here that we can kind of add?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's about creating common knowledge between parties about what people's needs are. Of course, that's easier said than done. But I mean, I think really therapy needs to move towards some communal healing model.
All right, interesting.
So in this small-scale societies, it's like the whole community maybe, or it could just be the people of importance to the patient or the individual who is unwell, who is depressed or suicidal or something. That, it's about creating knowledge about that person's vulnerability, because often people who are close to that person don't even know, because our therapeutic setting is so divorced from the rest of a person's life.
Right.
And it's seen as kind of their thing. So you tend to go to individual therapy, or even group therapy tends to be, it's just other people in your situation.
Right, with the same problem, but you're not like...
But it's like you need to get everybody's family and like spouses, or maybe even their employers. Like you just,
right. Yeah, all of the vested interests.
Yeah.
I think that's a really interesting point. I mean, it seems quite practical. It's a nice suggestion, and it's something that no one's really thinking about. But yeah, and I'm thinking now as like a friend or a family member or a colleague of someone who's going through those issues, and like I would often, I'd be more than happy to turn up to a session like that, and to like hear, their problems, or to kind of show my respect for them or my value of them. So yeah, I mean, maybe it's something that we can do that.
And then, of course, another part of that is that, is recognizing that, people, they can't solve these problems. So we have to respect that. Like this is, I think the first step is just realizing these are not individual problems. These are social problems that we can't resolve with individual therapy.
Yeah, sure. Right. And okay, I think this is a great message, and it's actually, it's quite positive. I think it's a really interesting explanation that kind of brings to light lots of things. And thank you so much for talking to me today.
Thank you so much, Adam.